you. So yeah, I guess I haven't come from massively across Europe. I've just come from West Ealing. So I'm local in London. But yeah, what I'm basically talking about is it's a project of work that I've been working on for actually really quite a few years now. This actually goes back probably about 30 years to when I was an undergraduate originally studying mathematics, but particularly been working on for about the last 15 years. Is that actually loud enough? Yeah. And I was actually working on this originally alongside doing visual effects and animation, and this was almost the project to keep me sane whilst I was working on other people's films, because this is what I was doing for myself. And basically I was trying to use the computers to explore almost the processes of growth. What is it about forms in nature and, that you see and you know these are grown forms? They're something that comes off usually from living processes. What is the nature of almost like form that comes from growth rather than form that comes from top-down design, almost traditional sort of engineering sort of design? And can we use the computers basically as a machine to simulate growth? So effectively almost coming up like artificial biology inside the computer. So what I'm basically doing is I'm not designing, saying like, okay, I want something like an oak tree or something like a biological thing and let's sculpt it down. I'm trying to come up with processes and almost like how do you influence and maybe slightly modify processes of growth to make it go off and do different things. And I'm actually wanting this to just sort of like surprise me. It's almost like an ongoing experiment. I'm not sure, is this art, is this science? I don't know, it's what I'm maybe obsessed with doing for myself. I'm often then sort of doing these things to make videos for people or do exhibitions. I'm starting to get more and more into things like sculpture. So I guess it's sort of being seen as artwork. But really it's almost my own exploration as into how can we create form which is almost, hopefully almost surprisingly, remarkably natural but also alien. Almost like sort of things that have contrast, alien but familiar. By actually creating things where you're writing rules at the level of individual cells splitting and how slightly modifying maybe how they take up food and when they decide to split, how they split in different ways, what happens? And then do slightly changing the rules result in very, very different forms. So I'm actually going to start playing, what you've probably seen a bit more of earlier, which was this video that I did a few years ago for a musician, Max Cooper. I'll just turn the volume down a little bit. But what this is actually showing is a number of different simulations of basically cell growth. So every simulation starts with the same ball of basically 42 cells. And then what the cell splits. So there's rules for, okay, when a cell has enough nutrient, it decides to split into 2 cells. But things like when it splits into 2 cells, which direction does it split in? If we split in one direction more than another direction, does that make the form grow in a different way? Also, when a cell is split, it then connects to the other cells, and each cell exerts forces on the other cells. Slightly different versions of the like strength of the forces may make very, very different structures. So it's basically almost experimenting with both this sort of system for growth and this system for then, okay, how, if you set it up one way, maybe it makes a very, very coral-like structure. Another way might be something that's almost like it pulses and actually looks really quite ugly and disgusting. And that's one thing I'm really very interested in is almost that there's things very natural, almost like visceral, I think, about natural forms or forms that look like they're grown. And some things maybe almost look quite beautiful, but some things almost look really quite revolting or disgusting. Almost what is it? I mean, particularly when I'm just presenting things, which in the end are really just white balls moving around. But I mean, when I have exhibitions, often you get comments in the guest book, typically like mesmerically beautiful or disgusting and disturbing are probably about the 2 most common comments I get. And what is it about certain forms that almost like elicit those sort of responses? And I think it's often particularly it's things that have this almost like saying cross between. It's almost familiar, but it isn't quite familiar. Or maybe it's a combination of two different familiar things. What is it about that? And how can this be created just by these sort of like exploratory processes? So obviously, I guess the first one I think is almost more coral-like, and this one, it's almost saying all the movement, everything in this is just coming from this simulation. It's not that I've used traditional animation things, and I haven't sort of sculpted a form, then said this area is to move faster, this area is to move slower. I've left it all just to the rules of growth and it's just naturally cells splitting and cells exerting forces on each other, which are actually all creating these. And all the colours in these pieces, these all come from the simulations. Things like these blue flashes, that's actually just showing the cells when they're splitting. So everything hopefully has some meaning coming from these growth simulations. Right. So, the influences behind this, actually I originally studied mathematics, and huge influences are the work of Alan Turing. Darcy went with Thompson and Ernst Haeckel. And basically, from Turing, Turing's obviously really known for his work in the computing, logic, involved in cracking the codes in the Second World War. One of the things, his most cited paper is actually about mathematical biology. It's about the patterns you see in nature on things like leopard spots and zebra stripes. How can those potentially come from extremely simple rules? So basically he created these ideas, what's called reaction diffusion equations, which are just very simple sort of sets of chemicals interacting with each other. Which can create potentially very, very rich, surprisingly almost like organic sort of shapes and forms. And these are actually often used in computer graphics now for creating like detailed textures on creatures. So things like in Avatar, for creating like detailed spots on the Na'vi and things like that, they're actually using reaction diffusion equations. Next is actually where the second guy with the beard is when Darcy went for Thompson, who is a Scottish zoologist and mathematician. And he wrote a book actually 100 years ago, so it was actually published in 1917, called On Growth and Form, which looks at how things, the sort of structures of things in nature, like seashells, like simple, like multicellular sort of forms, and also things like fish and mammals, and what are the commonalities between them? And almost like the way that lots of things take the sort of same pattern and reuse the same patterns in different ways. But also things like taking rules of physics, taking things like shapes you get from surface tension, but then modifying and changing those under influence to then be almost like making use of that. The structures you can create by almost like from the natural system you got, but for purpose, so that almost like the creatures making use of these things to create things like surfaces with huge amounts of area for gas exchange and things like that. So basically almost like how do I take a natural process thing, but then almost like bias it and influence it to almost like create something with a sort of given structure. And the third person up there is Ernst Haeckel, who's this German zoologist and philosopher, who did some amazingly beautiful studies of nature, often looking at sort of similarities and patterns between things like, starfish and pollen grains and sort of things where there's actually often echoes and similarities and things which are almost symmetric but not quite symmetric. So it's almost like what are the sort of like the general natures of things, structures that you see in nature. And also the way that I present a lot of my work is almost like a homage to Haeckel's sort of like, it's almost like simplicity of presentation. So about 15 years ago, I was working on a series called Aggregation, which is basically a series of creating sort of almost like the simplest structure I can almost imagine for growth, where you're creating a growing thing by repeatedly depositing things. So basically you're it's almost like a growth by deposition. It's almost like you've got, imagine like underwater, you've got food moving around. And then where the food hits the thing that's alive, it almost like eats it and grows. And almost like the bit where the food hits grows immediately. And if you create sort of structures like that, you can actually end up with these quite amazingly complex structures just by randomly moving things around and letting those just like deposit on almost like underflows underwater. And then you can look at almost like biasing and changing that in slightly different ways. What happens if you let it grow, almost like flow of water comes in from different directions? So things like coral growing underwater. If the water's really, really still, it'll tend to grow in one way. If coral's if the water's flowing in specific patterns, then it may grow to grow into very, very different forms. So what I was exploring in the aggregation series was almost changing the environmental rules that things are growing in. So almost having this very, very simple system of growth by deposition. But then if the way that the food moves around, or the way that almost like the boundary of the universe that the object is in, by slightly changing those, maybe you can influence things to grow in different ways, by almost like things growing underwater with different flows of water moving around. And what I found in the aggregation series was that you could create some really quite interesting sort of complex forms. But one of the things is that often the most interesting things always happen at sort of transition states. So this is a sort of a map showing things growing in a system where it was like water's swirling around, and there's also like a gravity force pulling the sort of like food particles downwards. And most things grow in this almost like sort of quite general sort of cauliflower sort of like way. If you have too much stirring it around, it's almost like things almost like being whipped around in a washing machine. Far too much, and it almost like everything gets shredded apart. But there's like this transition zone between the two, where surprisingly complicated, really interesting things start happening. Where it's almost like you expect things to grow in this cauliflower-like way, but when things almost at the tipping point where they're just about to be ripped apart, suddenly, interestingly unexpected things start happening. So now I'm going to go into more recent works. This is work in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, where I've basically been working on a system called Cellular Forms, which is a system, again, growth, but this growth by cells inside rather than just like things coming from the outside. And the idea of this was that what I was seeing in the earlier work was getting quite a rich variety of things, but everything tended to be sort of coral-like, fern-like, sort of these sort of branched-like structures. Thinking, what is it different about when you sort of see things almost like, animal-like things like, reptile skin or brains and lungs and things like that? What's different about those? Is often they may be more like folded surfaces. And maybe if I set up a system which is almost like in one limit is very much like the old aggregation system, but was actually more sheets that potentially of almost like rubber-like sheets that could fold and twist and change. Maybe that's a way of creating almost like a richer variety of different sort of like shapes and surfaces. So basically we're saying, well, these are the sheets, and you've got like cells connected to each other in a sheet. And then what you're doing is you keep on picking cells to be split. So cells accumulate food. When a cell has enough food, it splits into two. And what we then do is we must choose what biologists would call a plane of cleavage. So we choose the links to how we're going to split the cell. Then we create a new cell, almost like disconnect all the links on one side, connect the new cell into the sheet. So we're adding almost like a new cell into this almost like stretchy sheet when a cell splits in two. But also quite a few things to pick, like which direction do we split in? How strong are those springs between the cells? Quite a lot of things which maybe just subtle changes in those could make really big difference to the final structures and forms you get. So then the forces between them is just like springs, but there's also almost like two things, almost like one thing almost making the sheet want to bend. So that as the sheet gets compressed, it wants to bend outwards. And another force doing the opposite, so almost like trying to smooth things out. So that as you have a bend, it tries to push it back to being flat again. So almost these things working in tension against each other. So almost like if the tendency to want to fold was really strong, you might create a surface one way. If the tendency to want to smooth everything out was much stronger, things might grow a different way. So again, I don't know what these are going to do. It's just hopefully they have the potential to create interestingly different shapes and forms. And then the final thing I've got in here in general is just a system where each cell just tends to push the other cells away. And if you don't have this, it just almost always just degenerates into just being this random mass of just nothingness. Just like all the cells are just like, it was like a blob of jelly, was like random jelly. But just having a very simple, almost just like electrostatics, just like each cell tends to push the other cells away from each other. This chart is showing exactly the same setup, exactly the same forces and everything as the previous one, but also having this electrostatic force that just pushes cells away from each other. And suddenly you have the potential to have really rich, interesting, sort of like large-scale structures to come. So what do you get from this is, so these are some of the shapes and forms that you're getting from the system. So you're getting things, hopefully, some much more like sort of like folded brains and reptile skin and things like that. So I think this is almost a bit brain-like. This is a much more maybe sort of skin-like sort of thing. This is, things with like really big folds. And one of the things about this is saying that all the rules are just one cell pushing the ones, associating ones just around it. So everything's just local behaviour. But you end up with these really interesting big patterns and things. There's nothing like big, large scale. If I was doing this for computer graphics, for a client, for a film, for a design, I'll probably be designing, hey, let's paint this with lots of big stripes and things like that to make those folds. There's nothing like that in here at all. It's all just rules of the individual cells relating to the cells around. And yet you start ending up with these really big, interesting, large structures just happening, just emergently coming from the system. And here's another one. This is almost much more sort of coral-like sort of shape. And this one, actually, this is one thing that's interesting. When I say, actually, this system is quite unstable. Most of the time, what it produces is random rubbish, if I'm really honest. If you get the, so a lot of what I'm doing is how to actually work with it, how to find the areas, almost the combinations of values that produce something that looks interesting, has a coherence. Almost, one thing that's interesting though, really, almost every single thing that's produced that isn't just a complete random mess looks surprisingly lifelike. I mean, some of the rules I'm using are amazingly unbiological in some ways. It's amazing, it's ridiculously simple compared to real biology. But everything that the system produces that has, makes sense, looks like a proper structure, looks amazingly, I think it's like reminiscent of biology, or reminiscent of maybe a combination of one or two things of biology. And this is probably the least biological thing that's ever come out of the system. And even that, I think, looks natural. Maybe it's more like a rock formation. But I just wanted to surprise me. I was hoping for these like organic, rich, and looking things, but that everything it produces that doesn't just look wrong. Or by wrong, I just mean the simulation explodes into random noise and things like that. Tends always looks amazingly like shark scales, or like brains, or like maybe maggots growing or something like that. But they always look amazingly familiar in some ways. Maybe it says something about, is this almost what is the variety of things that grow pattern we create? Are we almost like seeing them all through almost like a system which is as unbiological, but is basically a gross system we can reproduce? And you have something like this, maybe it's like sharp scales, this much more brain-like sort of thing. And this is actually an X-ray, so that's sort of like that previous image. This is like an X-ray view through the sort of same structure. So showing that from the outside, you sort of see things like that, but on the inside, there's also sort of like, other things and variety happening. We've got a video. Okay, so this is simulation side by side. So this is like X-ray view into it. This is the outside. You see sort of different things. That the outside, you see all these waves of growth across the surfaces. On the inside, you start noticing there's this like little, it's like an embryo-like thing growing on the inside, which also, this all just comes spontaneously from the simulation. It's not that I have deliberately tried to make it do this behavior. It's just automatically by just stretches and springs and forces and cells growing, suddenly you get something. Suddenly you get something which is almost looks like, it's like amazing biological sort of structures. And then you've almost got this, it's almost like an experimental laboratory inside the computer that I've got. Once they started, well, just let's start changing it. What happens if we just start changing little things in the system? And one of the things I've been finding is often amazingly simple changes, tiny changes in the system can have huge effects on the results. So these ones was much more plant-like forms. Oops, I should play the video. If the video is playing right. Okay, so this is exactly the same setup as I had previously, but instead of food, there was like light coming from all around the structures, which was like hits the cells and makes the food. This is where light only comes from the top. So, but by changing one thing in the system, just that the food that cells, or the light that creates the food that the cells need to grow, only comes from above rather than from all around, suddenly you get plants or funguses and things like that. And all this branching just happens again, it's automatically, naturally. It's not that I've programmed it to branch, 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 branch. It's just the cells split, the cells grow, the cells have forces between each other. And naturally, at some points, there's little instabilities and you get branching complex sort of structures. Sometimes maybe it depends maybe how much the cell gobbles all the food itself, or whether the cell shares food with the other cells. If it shares with the cells food with other cells, what I find is it produces much more almost like fungal-like things. Almost like really simple, just changes the rules, but producing, almost like another rich variety of structure. These are sort of some of the, I really quite like this one. I think this almost looks like something out of Terry Gilliam's imagination, but just coming, as I set these, when I was working in the visual effects industry, I'd just set these things off before I went to work in the morning, come back in the evening and find, mostly it produces rubbish, but maybe once every other month or so it produces something like that, and you just go, okay. And it gives you another direction to go off and explore. Now into another sort of a very small variation. All those previous ones I showed you, effectively all the cells were the same. Almost each cell had exactly the same rules as every other cell. In this series, all I did was, okay, let's just have the simplest version of cell variation. Let's have two different types of cells, so that they're almost like, we start with a ball with the cell at the top is one sort of set of properties, the cell at the bottom has a different set of properties, and the cells between them just like blends between them. What happens then? Do these cells, because these cells can potentially grow in slightly different ways, hopefully you get something a bit more complicated. And the answer is even just with that tiny, almost like simplest version of cell differentiation, you start getting amazingly more complicated, almost much more lifelike sort of structures. Almost like really looking like almost like multicellular sort of like sea life. So this is saying, almost like how simple the system is compared to real biology is, I think most biologists will either they're fascinated by or hate this. It's sort of like but all these, it's basically almost like one end of this structure is growing one way, the other end is growing another way. So it tends to, instead of growing into just like a simple ball, they almost like fight with each other, the different cell types in the structure. So all the movement, everything in this is just coming from the simulation. It's just cells at the same time as each other tend to split together, because it's almost like cells next to each other will tend to have accumulated the same amount of food. They'll tend to split sort of like coherently, almost like a wave together. So everything really, there's no rabbits up my sleeves, I'm only wearing a t-shirt today. It's just, everything really is just coming through the simulation. Running out of time. Actually, if you go to Vimeo, I've got a website on Vimeo just for Andy Lomas channel on Vimeo. I've got most of those videos up on there. And this is a more recent actually work that I'm still working on at present, which I call in constrained forms, which actually the installation piece for the party tonight is actually based on some of this work. And this is almost looking at how to influence the biology. I was saying like the coral growing in sort of flowing water. It's almost like trying to influence the structure to grow in slightly different ways, where it's things like, these are always like tubular things, where it's almost like the cells are grown starting as a tube and the top cells have to stay in the top and the bottom cells stay at the bottom, but the cells between can almost be stretched. And if the cell, as the structure gets more and more of an overhang, maybe the rates of growth can change. So maybe things happen vertically different from horizontally and things like that. So just giving like potential in here for things to grow in different ways influenced by different things. So it's almost instead of designing it just like, almost like, can I give it a potential for different structures and when seeing what happens. In particular, I'm interested in some of this form to potentially turn into more sculpture-like sort of things. And these are some of the sort of structures. Actually, this one here I'm particularly interested in. Can I fabricate this? So can I actually turn this into like proper almost like sculptural sort of forms? So one thing, and I was running out of time. I thought I had a little bit longer, but I'm just going to talk very briefly about one of the issues that I've got. I should just go through these quite quickly to. Okay, so one of the issues, problems I've got, which actually is almost like a problem that life itself has, is I've got this system with a number of parameters, a number of potential influences. How do I find the moments? How do I make use of that? How do I, say most of the time this system actually produces almost like random rubbish. How do I find the things where it's actually doing interesting stuff? So when I was working on my earlier work, the aggregation series, I could basically create charts like that one I sort of showed you earlier, with just when I've only got like 2 or 3 different things actually influencing it, where you can actually just generate lots and lots of things and just look for the things that look really most interesting. With this more cellular growth system, basically I started having more and more parameters in there, which all potentially could do interesting things. And the simplest version of Cellular Forms, I had 12 parameters, which is already getting almost overwhelming, trying to think like, how do I change these values? If I find something that looks interesting, how do I find next, what does that mean? How do I change the values to find something else that's interesting? Or if I just find rubbish, how do I explore the landscape? How do I find, discover things within this space? Which I think this is always a problem with quite a lot of things. I mean, music, it's almost like having a synthesizer with too many controls and not knowing, believing you can produce some really interesting sounds with it, but not knowing how to find them. And then there's got the plant-like forms that basically had 19 parameters, the hybrid forms are 32 parameters. So it's starting to get more and more sort of parameters in these systems. And there's a classic problem what's called curse of dimensionality, which is basically the thing of, as you add more and more parameters, it becomes basically more and more difficult to be able to explore the space, to find things in there. So if you only got like 8, if you're trying to just like take 8 samples of something, if you've got 1 parameter with 8 samples, you just need to, take 8. With two dimensions, you need to take 64 samples to see those, what the effect of those 2 parameters are if you're taking 8 values for each parameter. 3 parameters, you need 512 parameters, which is what roughly I was doing in the aggregation things. I needed about 512 almost like plot 512 values, and I could sort of see the whole space. As you add more and more dimensions, you start getting, basically it starts going up exponentially. So basically you get to 10 dimensions, you would need 1 billion samples to give you the same, almost like exploring the space of possibilities. So there are quite a lot of different approaches that people have taken over the years to this. One of which is almost taking a leaf out of biology, is can you use almost evolutionary approaches, almost like simulating mutation, simulating crossbreeding, to explore the space of possibilities. So there's lots of work pre-done in the 80s and 90s and evolutionary interfaces. And all I'd say is, I use these actively, but what I find is they're good for some things, but really bad for other things. The evolutionary interfaces tend to be very good for almost as soon as you find something good, something interesting, they focus the search more and more on the area where they've found something that has a survival advantage, something that, it finds something that has the hint of something good, and it then can exploit that. What unfortunately I find really bad at is often things like trying to find novelty, trying to explore spaces more generally. You find almost like little niches in the space where like this works really, really well, but you have no maybe information about what works other places in the space. Alternatively, more recently, there's been quite a lot of work done in machine learning and influencing design through machine learning and things like that, often by understanding structures, understanding systems of like architecture and aircraft design and things like that, where they've been almost like running lots of simulations to teach a machine learning system, almost like what makes a good aerodynamic plane or what makes a structure that can stand up. So these are often done which are almost like learning about a very, very specific system to sort of help a designer. What I'm actually sort of been interested in is almost like a simpler version of machine learning. Is almost, can I just use machine learning almost like a counterpoint to the evolutionary things to be able to, almost as an alternative, and maybe one that I can more direct to say things, almost like, how do I want you to explore the space? Particularly things like looking for novel things rather than looking for, just trying to find, if you really found something that looks good, just exploit it. So almost like, I'm basically just saying, after I've found, I'm looking at space, trying those things out. Well, can the computer almost assist me? Can it almost like make the best use of things that I've found and said, I like this, I don't like that. Or, these things all look like brains. These all things look like asparaguses. Is there something that's almost like a brain asparagus? Is there something, what is in space between the two? So it's almost like trying to say, as I start creating everything, almost like trying to put them in that information back into the computer to almost get it to start learning almost like what I like, how I categorize things, to then help me sort of search the space. Almost like feels like a collaboration. So this is one thing I've been working on for about 5 or 6 years now, is almost like the backstory behind the more obvious stuff is writing this computer code for these simulations and almost like the creating the visuals. But the backstory is I've also been almost probably spending as much, if not more, work on how almost like a tool that helps me explore the spaces, where it's using a combination of evolutionary techniques and machine learning techniques, where I'm doing things like, this is basically showing things like, I've got these forms and I'm rating them saying these ones are junk, these actually just failed, so they're just white out where it didn't even get to the end of the simulation before it had failed. Most of these are really boring, really, these get a bit more interesting, these are the most interesting. So these are where I'm just rating things. So basically I'm giving information, I'm rating things, I'm categorizing things, and then I'm using that information to help inform the decision about what to try next, what to try next, what to try next. It's another picture of the interface. So you see it's almost like, down here it's junk, and here's the most interesting thing I've found so far in this run. And it takes quite a long time. Almost like you're having to teach the computer things. So when I've got a new system, it might take a week or two to almost like try to teach it, to learn what parameters seem to work, what parameters don't work in that space. Results, well, everything I've shown you on the cellular form stuff onwards, all of that work has all been generated using this software. So what I'd say is that when I first created this simulation engine, and I just, it was almost like overwhelming of like, I do not know how to start to explore that. All the interesting results I have found. I found the first version of the system, I found some things that looked sort of okay. The software seemed to be working, but it felt almost like frustrating because it felt like I'm sure there are more interesting things this system could create, but I'm not seeing it yet. I was almost having to be too cautious, and also almost like creating the system to be too stable. Actually, that's one thing I'd say is the interesting things tend to happen, I think, with transition points between almost like phases. So it was like you got these systems that tend to produce same behavior in lots of the space, same behavior in another area of the space, and there's some transition zones between behaviors where often interesting things happen. And also it's often maybe functions which are a bit unruly, a bit naturally unstable. Things that have a lot of feedback into themselves tend to be unstable sort of functions, but maybe have the most potential for interesting results. That you want to have almost like using almost like this system, which was like the computer assisting me exploring the space. It feels to me almost like it's helping free me up to be maybe just a bit more reckless, a bit more sort of brave to go out there and try deliberately making unstable functions and exploring what they do, rather than trying to play safe just with something which I know everywhere is going to produce an okay result, but maybe I'm not seeing the really interesting, surprising things. So in some ways this system is sort of like as much the backstory behind what I've been doing, but it feels almost like a really important part of the work. It's allowed me to work in a much more, it feels almost like natural way, saying what things I like, I don't like, rather than being overwhelmed by numbers, basically. So, and here's actually, this is one that's almost like accidental. All these branches, they are actually almost a result of a bug, well, basically a result of a bug in the code. That I was growing things with these things like where it overhangs more than a certain amount, it can slow down the growth rates, thinking that, okay, maybe that's a good thing to stop things overhanging too much, because that's going to make it difficult to fabricate if I'm trying to turn this into a real sculpture. I also, okay, nice idea, and it works to a point, but actually really bad idea. It's almost like never try to outguess biological-like systems. So what actually happens, though, is that as things get beyond that overhang, it almost freezes them. So it's almost like things solidify so that things become permanently, sort of ingrained if they've gone beyond that angle, almost like wood. And in this one, I also had a bug in the code, which was I was forgetting to make the cells smaller as this thing was growing between these planes, as far as the light rays were concerned. So this is what was rendering, but as far as the light rays were concerned, every cell was huge. It's almost like blown up like the Michelin Man. Which meant that a cell that was slightly poking out further than the other cells got all the food, because all the light would hit that and it would shadow all the cells behind it. So basically the combination of this, almost like go beyond a certain angle and everything becomes frozen, or sort of solidified, and all things that stick out a little bit more grabbed all the food, meant that you naturally just got all these crazy tendrils and branches sort of forming. So it was utterly not deliberate, but at least I can then look at it and say, well, oh, probably completely unfabricatable, and I've got some, actually these are the pieces I've got playing on the installation thing later. Some of these get to tiny little sort of filigree, sort of like tendrils going out, which hopefully if I'm just showing it as a digital image, it looks really interesting. As far as the original purpose of being things I could sculpt, utterly useless. But hopefully I can then go back to then, if I fix the bug, then I get things like that. So hopefully I can, two different directions, almost like unexpectedly going off to almost explore in the space. So that's, I think, basically the end of my talk. This is from an exhibition I had last year. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for your attention. I don't know, I'm probably over time already, so I don't know whether you've got any time for questions at all. Am I going to be thrown off the stage? Okay, right, so if anyone does want to ask any questions, I'm not being thrown off the stage. Yes, so you're asking about this is my own code and software that I'm writing this, which is maybe slightly crazy. I do know when I've written some papers about this. If you go to my website, there's a paper that gives basically the algorithms and the forces I'm using and things like that, which I probably could use lots of others as well. I do know 2 groups of students who've actually re-implemented some of these algorithms themselves. One of whom was using Houdini as an animation system which is probably the closest animation system to doing this sort of work. I think I'm getting to higher levels of detail. They got to a few, I think, tens or hundreds of thousands of cells. I'm often running things to 70 or 80 million cells. So it's slightly crazy, but I guess one of the things I'm trying to push is resolution and detail. So I've actually written this all in what's called CUDA, which is basically all the stuff for how the cells divide, all the simulation engine, and actually all the code for actually rendering the cells is all written in CUDA, which is basically a language to program the graphics card and make use of all the ridiculous amounts of power that you have potentially in the graphics card for doing things. So I write slightly crazy amounts of code. So yeah, I've had every so often I get quite inquiries, and I've met a few people from generally on the biology side. Once they realise how unbiological this is, they often just okay, that's interesting, but well, they just say well, that's rubbish, or they say that's really interesting that it almost looks like this, but actually it's not interesting biology because it's so different from trying to simulate real biology processes. Where of course I've had a lot more interest is on the artificial life side, which I guess is, it's the one-line description is the study of life as it could be rather than life as it is, which is, I guess, very much more what I'm doing here. So actually, 2 years ago, where they had the main International Artificial Life Conference in the UK, I was actually invited to do an exhibition. Which actually, the first time the hybrid forms was presented was for an exhibition at ECAL, the European Conference on Artificial Life, 2 years ago. And I was also invited to actually give one of the keynote presentations to the conference, which was really nice, and had lots of very interesting conversations with a lot of the researchers. And it was actually really interesting, just genuine dialogue. Particularly how the levels of detail I was pushing to, which partly comes from having a background in computer graphics animation. You learn a lot of techniques and tools for how to push, more and more and more and more sort of like general visual data sort of detail. So because I was using those techniques, I was often getting to think to higher levels of detail than they were often getting in their own work. So yeah, there's been really quite an interesting interchange with that. Sorry? I am thinking about using some like deep learning techniques, the neural nets. I'm actually just joined Goldsmiths as a visiting research fellow recently, And part of that is potentially to carry on some of this research on this, exploring this interface. I think that's actually different things within that, that there's the actual estimation of what are better areas of the space. I'm not sure that deep learning would be the best techniques for, but almost the more emulating what I'm doing, automatically ranking and categorizing, so that can it learn, you know, so that instead of me having to rank and categorize things all the time, well, at present I'm doing all that by hand myself. Is deep learning, deep neural network style techniques appropriate for that? I think they probably could be. So it's almost like after I've told it these 100 things I'm saying they're brain-like, does it start recognizing that itself? So it's almost, I would probably be looking at almost like machine learning almost like 2 levels in the system. So one is the, at a totally new parameter value, predicting whether this is an interesting or not interesting area of the space. Another one is, after I've done the simulation, can it categorize that reliably, automatically itself? So yeah, I'm actually interested in both. I'm only doing half of that at present. Yeah. And I think I could also be using much better techniques. Yeah, okay, one more question, am I allowed? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess one thing that would be interesting is like whether do different people have different preferences? Is one person exploring, does that result in different things from lots of people together? Sort of like, you know, like, yeah, is there individual preference differences or not? It would be interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Balls? No, so far all the growth has been from starting with balls, or the ones where they're saying like they're tubes to start with. So there's the more sculptural ones, but they were actually deliberately trying to be like vase-like things. So they were starting as a tube. I could start with any shape. All right, okay. Yeah. I mean, in some ways, though, I think it's actually often more the process and the influences that actually has a much bigger effect on the final structure, unless you have strong constraints in there. So things like the tubular shapes, because I'm saying that the top ring of cells has to be in the top plane, and the bottom ring of cells has to be in the bottom plane. That's almost like, it's almost like this sort of like this rubbery thing that's almost like sort of held between these two things. That keeps it sort of almost like a tubular vase-like thing. If I didn't have that, I think almost most shapes I start with might end up with very similar looking structures in the end after it's grown and grown and grown and grown. Okay, right, I have to wrap up. Thank you very much. Yeah.